coming back again to your point of wonder and awe and beauty, because that refreshes and renews and grounds us. And I want to really pick up your exceedingly important point about academia, because, we can say with the religions there's problems and there's promise, but academia has such a split between knowledge and values, which is an undercurrent of this discussion. So all the knowledge that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been giving out for more than 25 years, that we're in a crisis. The knowledge has not changed the action, and in part because science is not about, they don't even really want to create, they want to create the metrics for policy, the knowledge for policy, but they don't want to be advocates and action and so on. And that's where the religious communities and people with a moral concern have to come together. But I'll turn it over to John in a moment, but we've experienced this certainly in our whole academic career between a divinity school, very much committed to the human and social justice, and a science-based school of the environment committed to science. These are the silos in which we live, kind of humans and nature. And finally, they're coming together, I think, in a number of concerns like environmental justice. But one scientist, not here, but a very well-known ecologist, said when we showed our Journey of the Universe film that evokes awe and wonder about the universe and the earth, he said, this is beautiful, but I can't talk about wonder in my classroom. So this split between knowledge, values, human emotion, and concern is a very serious one, a very old one, and exceedingly complex, but it needs to be addressed and woven back together.
I'm struck, Walter, also by your bringing us to consider the problematic understanding, or the understanding of a problematic world, or the problems in the human within traditions. And the traditions I study, especially Indigenous peoples. And what strikes me as interesting among Indigenous people and in our own times is the problems are with human-earth relations, and the responses, or the deepest answers, are also in human-earth relations. The sense of, rather than looking to a transcendent revelation or a scriptural revelation, there's a revelation within the earth itself. And I realize that traditions have their own different ways of looking at revelatory mediums. But I think in our own times, we're beginning to turn again to that question of what is the deepest meaning of our relationship with the earth, and that brings us into an understanding of who we are as humans.
Picking up on that, John, that yearning for transcendence and connection, the integration, as you would describe it, humans to earth, or humans with one another,
yes,
or even
yes.
integration within the human psyche itself. And I want to connect that to a comment, Mary Evelyn, that you made about this professor who could teach the science but couldn't teach the wonder of the science, or couldn't talk about the wonder. That seems to me kind of disintegrative. It's like pulling us apart. We as humans want the knowledge and the wonder. Maybe critiques have been made about religious communities eschewing experts, this kind of diminishment of scientific expertise by some segments of evangelicalism. To whatever extent that may be true and reflective of a disintegration between knowledge and value from the religious side of things, I'm really curious about what you've just described as the disintegration on the academic side of things, because I wonder if there is a point of reintegration if we're being honest about our own self-assessments and the profound need we have for one another. So landing the question is, what gave rise to that disintegration? Why can we talk about the science and not the wonder in academic settings?
I think that's really at the heart of the matter. I really do. I want to begin, of course, by saying we value science. We wouldn't understand the environmental problems without science. And some of people are doing incredible work in remote parts of the world, in cold and heat and jungles and so on, for us to understand how these systems work. ecosystems have evolved over time. They are incredibly complex. And for me, they evoke nothing but wonder. But as we know, we're all educated in a certain worldview. Theologians are educated in a certain worldview, ministers, etc. And scientists are educated through the lens of an empirical method, which objectifies the world, and then you can measure it and give metrics and numbers, and you can begin to understand it from this view that brings it apart from yourself in a certain way. Now, the empirical method, coming out of the last several hundred years of scientific study, is very valuable. So again, I want to underscore the explosion of science has been extremely valuable. But how it is then communicated or taught is another thing. And the training leads to, it's very matter of fact. You don't put yourself back into these systems. Now, this is not true for everyone. People who study glaciers and the Amazon who are deeply engaged in it. But by and large, it does create this distance. And that distance, while it has some positive dimensions, it has negative consequences because it leaves the whole human with an emotional and spiritual longings and yearnings. So understanding's not just a mental thing, it's a heart thing, it's the whole person. And how we can put this back together, that's the question. Of course, people who do field studies are doing it quite a bit, but we need a language that is sort of bifocal, if you will, that says, yes, I see what the science is telling me. And yes, I see how I'm connected here, to the diversity of life. Every child loves insects or turtles or loves watching migrating birds, whatever it is. It's filled with just astonishing things. And I do think this is coming back together in certain ways because the scientists who are studying, for example, forests, are realizing that the root systems are actually communicating, that these are communicating systems. But it's being felt as a living earth community, again, a sacred community, we would say in more religious language. And that is also leading, almost unexpectedly, but in a very direct way, to advocacy for the life of the whole community. If we're pro-life, we're pro all of life. It has to be that wide, that inclusive. So I think we're beginning to weave this back together.
Wow, thank you. What would you say, from your perspective, are some of the things that you would wish for evangelical communities to know about the academic community? What would you say you would wish my world would know about your world?
Mm-hmm. Well, one observation I would make is the eruption of gatherings of people studying the communication going on within the natural world itself between plants, rhizome systems, and fungi, for example, and the communication of animals and marine life, and this emerging focus even on the words like consciousness and community and culture being extended into species that we considered numb or unable to really undertake those types of inter-species communication. And the term that in the academic community I find helpful is inscendence, and to realize that the transcendence that we have understood in the religious community as a sense of awe in the creative dimension of that which brought forth this universe, that also inscendence, that within the universe itself something is being revealed to us. It's being spoken by the creatures. So just as we opened our discussion with our stories of who we are, the world, each dimension of the world is telling its story. And it's as if it were pages of a revelatory text. And when we lose these voices, we are tearing out these pages from the text of an incredible scripture.
I think, again, this is such an important question, and I hope even beyond this wonderful conversation, we'll continue it, Walter, because you have a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard, and you know the academic world and inside and out, and so your range is marvelous for our mutual understanding. I think to pick up one thing I said about the empirical method, it has its usefulnesses, but when an empirical method becomes a worldview, namely objectivist, and therefore it can be exploited, you see, because it's so objectivist. So the underside of empiricism and reductionism, it's all just stuff. It's just matter. It's not living matter. It's not, where's the spiritual energy, within things. So we can dissect animals without thinking that they're conscious and things of that nature. There's a whole reductionist sensibility. We are creatures in a creative Earth system. And here's the thing. How can we have mutual respect, as you just said, between the evangelical community, the academic community? I think this is crucial because scientists and other academics have been, at times, let's just say, a little bit arrogant about knowledge drives everything. And now we're seeing, and with the unraveling of university systems at the moment, we're having to confront this breakdown to hopefully break through to other ways of knowing and being and valuing in the world that takes diversity of people, opinions, spiritualities very seriously and doesn't dismiss them. So we've got to build the bridge, don't we, between respecting scientists from the non-scientific world and vice versa, academics and other scientists understanding in dialogue, in conversation, people of religious faith. And I'll just give, two examples. Katharine Hayhoe is obviously an amazing scientist, an evangelical, and her husband's an evangelical preacher. And she's done so much, hasn't she, in this bridge. And she's a scientist for Nature Conservancy. We do have some scientists who are doing this work. And that, I think, will help a lot. And bridge building through conversation will really help. But tell us what your opinion might be or your suggestions of reweaving science and religion back together.
Yeah. No, I think that's fantastic, what you've already described. And both Katharine Hayhoe has done a lot of work with World Evangelical Alliance and instrumental in that. Francis Collins, we've collaborated on a number of issues at the NAE with Francis Collins, who is, in fact, I think, attending a small evangelical church at this particular point. So I would say they're great examples of bridge builders, people who occupy comfortably and navigate comfortably spaces within the academic scientific community and within faith-based evangelical communities. And we need more bridge builders. But we also need to create relational proximity. My concern would be by focusing so much on the bridge builders, it alleviates both sides' responsibility to actually get to know each other. So we can cite a bridge builder and say, oh, the work is done, without actually having to do the work ourselves of building these bridges and relational proximity. I think one of the challenges is most humans, I would describe the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Knowledge, we can have all the stats, we can create compelling arguments, but not be wise in how we navigate things. You undoubtedly experience this in marriage. You can marshal all the right arguments for why something should be this way, but there's not going to be actual persuasion, right? There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And the ability to persuade, I think, requires relational proximity, a closeness, so that the trust in the academic world is in the currency of expertise and degrees. You gain credibility through the degrees you have, through the papers you've written. For most other parts of society, that's not credibility building. And so what counts as an expert in one domain doesn't actually count as an expert in another domain. And in religious communities, yes, theological education, degrees, they do make some difference. But by and large, you go to your pastor not because he or she has a degree. You go to your pastor because your pastor is available. Your pastor loves your family. Your pastor has walked with you through a diagnosis that was so traumatic. It's that relational proximity that is perhaps one of the highest currencies within a religious tradition, and certainly within evangelicalism. So one of the things that I would love to see is for the academic community to recognize that the currency of credibility in an academic world is not the same in a different setting. And relational proximity is going to be absolutely critical. How could you enter into the world as people, not as the expert coming in, but just as a human, into communities, into churches, into spaces in which no one actually will know that you have a degree from Yale or teach at Yale or started this whole program at Harvard. They actually know you as a human who happens to have these concerns, and that the trust that gets built because of the credibility of proximity begins to actually gives you the space to become a credible expert in these other ways as well, because there's just basic trust there. I think that is why folks that are the bridge builders, Catherine Hayhoe or Francis Collins that you've cited, they're actually not trusted from the faith-based side because they're experts in science. They're trusted because they're proximate. Their spouse is a pastor. They talk about their conversion story. I mean, all these things that make them proximate.
I find that path very interesting, Walter, and very engaging because I associate it with story. That when an academic or someone who's delivering remarks or a speech, if people feel their story, who they are, I think that proximate relationship occurs. I wanted to take that understanding of an intimacy and a distance simultaneously, that all of life seems to express itself in this capacity for intimacy, and yet we find ourselves often in distance from that same relationship. To bring it into the entrepreneurial world that you brought us to earlier, and how important that is in this discussion of environmental attitudes, because, and I mean by that, not simply the business community, which kind of frames it differently, because entrepreneurial is a word I think that has a story about it. I find it very difficult to think about how our economics or our world of exchange will recover some of that feeling, that felt relationship with the world that we care about, especially as you mentioned early on in your remarks. The American scene, we're very independent-minded, entrepreneurial. I have the right to establish the possibility of feeding my family, of taking care of my family. All of those then become embedded also or associated with the values in religious traditions too. And so I think that's what as an academic, I'm very interested in that question of how we enter into a relationship of use, or we will use the world, but a way in which we have that sense of proximal relationship, or we have an intimacy.
Yeah, I realize that's a very important point maybe to leave as a question for all of us to think about going forward, because I do think the youth relationship is a huge part of the problem of what we're facing. And I also think that the bridge building has got to be, we've got knowledge over here, we've got values over here, we've got science here and religion here. But the bridge, isn't it about a mutual concern for life and the future of life? And that, again, it comes back to this food, health, and children. I think we've got to take off the academic pretensions and degrees, move out of the certainties of religious truths. Each side has their sense of my truth is the only truth, and that's part of the problem. But if we come to a sense, we put those down and say, once again, even if we don't understand all the particulars, we can see with floods, with fires, with weather conditions, with droughts, with hunger around the world, as you described.
The justice issues.
The justice issue, that we have areas of common concern. It's a love for people. It's a love for our planet. And that's where I think knowledge and values can be rejoined with care, with concern, with love. So I'd love you to conclude this in any way you might, Walter, but it's such a joy to be with you. It really is a very pleasurable, and we're very honored to be with you here in this discussion.
John, Mary Evelyn, thank you so much. And I would heartily concur by finding issues of common concern, human concerns, that from my community would be concerns that not are left in the human realm, but they have a divine mandate, of loving our neighbor, of loving God by caring for the creation that he has given to us in this world. But by keeping it simple, it's about food, health, and children. You've just framed it in a way that distills what would bind us together in our call to love one another well, and share common concerns and build a common cause, and to give some latitude to the entrepreneurial way in which different communities might lend expression to that, and be committed to it, because it's a multifaceted problem, right? You're not all going to agree on what the right policy or governmental position should be, or what a business actually should do. But rather than become so enamored with my idea of this is how it should be solved, here's my definition of the problem, and here's my definition of the solution, and anything that veers from that can't possibly be as good. But to recognize that, okay, you're not going to be involved with policy, but can you be involved with planting a tree? Can you be involved in cleaning up the air for children to be able to breathe better? Maybe it is a policy issue. Maybe you're going to become an environmental scientist, but maybe you're simply going to try to do good in your neighborhood with the people that are being impacted by climate events, catastrophes. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that let's figure out where we can begin and take a step together. And as we journey together, maybe discover we have more things in common. And when our paths veer, because undoubtedly they will veer, even with the closest of friends, you'll have a slightly different path. Those things happen, but there can be fostered an inordinate amount of goodwill and trust if we begin with that which really is common. And I love the way you put it. We can get behind food, health, children.
Thank you so much, Walter.
It's wonderful to meander in this conversation with you like a river, and the meander of a river has intentions behind it that we're still trying to discover too. But these conversations meander in a way that's very heart-filling, heart-warming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Walter.